My name's Mercedes. I'm with Rocky Nook. Thank you so much for joining us today. I see quite a few of you have logged in to join us this morning, and we really appreciate you coming here. So thank you so much. Just a couple housekeeping things I want to mention and get out of the way before I let Harold take it over. If you are joining us today, you did receive a coupon in your email, which I'll post up in the chat too in a minute. And that coupon is redeemable on either one of Harold's Rocky Nook books, which are Creative Garden Photography, which you're here today to learn a little bit more about, and then Creative Black and White. So you can use that coupon on the Rocky Nook website to save 40% on both of those books. Don't worry if you've forgotten it, I will put that coupon code in the chat, and it will also be in an email we send to you tomorrow. So tomorrow we're gonna send you another email with a replay link of this webinar. So if you miss anything or if you have to leave early, don't worry, you're gonna be sent a link tomorrow so you can watch this again at your convenience. And that email will also include the coupon code for both of Harold's books, Creative Black and White Photography and Creative Garden Photography. One more thing I just want to mention is that if you already have either or both of those books, and if you've enjoyed them, we would really appreciate it, and so would Harold, if you can drop a review on Amazon for us for that book. That really helps other people to know what they're getting into and see what the book's about, and helps other people find those books, which may be helpful to them in their photography practice as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned, we have Harold Davis with us, who is the author of Creative Black and White Photography and Creative Garden Photography. And today he is here to talk to us about garden photography, which is really exciting. So without any further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Harold. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing. We will answer questions at the end, but go ahead and feel free to submit your questions as you have them throughout the webinar. And then in the last 10, 15 minutes, we'll get to those questions and Harold will answer them for you. So anyway, welcome Harold. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Mercedes. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone.
I will let you take it over from here. I'll see you at the end with some questions.
Okay, I look forward to the questions, and thank you for the nice introduction. Hi, everybody. So the theme of today is taking the garden inside. So one of the things about garden photography that is so totally cool is that it's something we can do these days without too much worry. And as the weather gets colder, there's a lot we can do inside. I'm gonna, instead of looking at me, I'm going to share my screen and get started on the actual presentation I had in mind. Okay, so this is called Bringing the Garden Inside. And here's the cover of my black and white book, Creative Black and White. Here's the cover of Creative Garden Photography. And the subtitle of Creative Garden Photography is Making Great Photos of Flowers, Gardens, Landscapes, and the whole beautiful world around us. And it is a very, very beautiful world, no matter what may be happening in it. So we tried to make this book a happy book, with the cover, which is a happy cover, and photographing flowers, gardens, and so on is such a wonderful, happy, lovely thing to do. If you look at the table of contents of Creative Garden Photography, you'll see that it's really divided into 4 parts. I'm not sure how well you can actually read it on your screens, but this will give you the general idea. So there's a short part, which is called Entering the Garden, and that's about what gardens are, what they're like, why they're important, what garden design is about, and that kind of thing. And I usually can't resist throwing a few slides in that have something to do with that. Then there's a pretty large part of the book, Photographing the Garden at Large, which is how do you deal with a garden outside? What is lighting? How do you best focus? How do you handle depth of field? And a variety of topics like that. That's one of the major parts of the book. The second major part of the book, you see on the right-hand page of the table of contents here, is called Taking the Garden Close Up and Inside. And that's what we're gonna concentrate on today, is that part, because you don't need anything outside or anything more than a small patio or even a even a window that opens and has plants in it, or plants inside, as I do in my living room. At the back of the book is a resources and notes section. And one of the things in the resources and notes section is this list of figures you see on the left page here. So I post that here to explain that while hopefully the photographs in my book are of what they would say coffee table quality, the contents is how-to contents and technical. So you can see that from the list of figures. We have, for example, hyperfocal distance and infinity and how that works, and how multi-raw processing works, and what the fundamental law of reflection is, as shown as a diagram, the various kinds of lighting, all kinds of fairly detailed technical material is also in the text of this book, along with descriptive captions of the exposure data and the story behind almost every photo in the book. And the gardens in the book are shown on the right here. So this is a book that went around the world. The topics that I'm going to focus on in this webinar are photographing flowers for transparency on a light box. As many of you likely know, that's one of my specialités. And photography on black and intimate flowers, by which I mean the pun. In other words, it's flowers as macro photography, and also flowers that are intimate, because as I like to say, you can see the gender and sex issue of flowers very up close and personal as you photograph them for macro work. So I threatened or promised to throw in a few photographs about the garden at large and what it means to be a garden. So here's an introduction to that segment of this presentation. This is the Parc de Sceaux in one of the suburbs in Bourg de la Reine, a suburb of Paris. It's an André Lenotte designed garden, the gentleman who designed Versailles and the Tuileries and so on. And you can get a pretty clear sense of place from that. This is a photograph in Monet's garden at Giverny, in the section where the water lily ponds are, because Giverny, for those of you who visited it, is divided into two sections. The one where he dammed the local river and made his famous water lily ponds, and then you go under an underpass and you go into the flower section of the garden. This is the approach to a Zen monastery garden in the headlands of Marin near San Francisco on a foggy day. And I call this one the road less traveled. So there are a lot of different kinds of gardens. The wilderness may be a garden. That's what I mean by a walk on the wild side. People grow gardens for status. You know, you live in the right kind of suburb and you have a good garden. That's a status symbol garden just as much as Versailles was for King Louis XIV. I've been growing a fair amount of edibles in my garden this year. I call it my pandemic garden. We've got obviously tons of tomatoes. We also have figs, 4 or 5 kinds of apples, lemons, all kinds of things, scallions, green onions, potatoes. We grow a lot of potatoes. There are flowery gardens, memory gardens. Gardens have played a big role in life. A specific kind of garden, the French garden, tends to have a very emblematic formal shape and size. This is a plan of André Lenotte's Versailles, and here's a pretty generic French garden that called Villandre in the Loire Valley that I photographed a few years back. Parc de Sceaux with its row of pollarded trees, very formal, very well manicured, very wall-like. Japanese gardens are another, they're as formal as French gardens, but they tend to involve things that are less animate, and there's more of a sense of passing time. This rock garden, for example, a temple rock garden in Kyoto, is symbolic of a storm with water drops falling down into a pond. This is the Isuin Garden in Nara, the old imperial capital of Japan. This is back in Giverny, the upside of what were the train tracks when Monet made his garden, and this is just fairly unfrenchified flower beds going back under an arbor. And this is, I think, my last of my landscape garden photos for this presentation. An informal garden along the Camino Portuguese, the pilgrimage trail coming into Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, which somebody just made in the side of an old fortification along the trail, a very informal kind of garden. So one of the things you want to look at when you bring a camera into a garden as landscape is how are you going to do it? What role do time and lighting play? What is the best camera and lens to use? How do you capture the soul of a given garden? How do you know what the soul of a garden is? Moving on, let's photograph flowers for transparency on a light box. So many of you may have seen some of my webinars on live or on YouTube about this, so this will be a recap. But why do it? Who's your mama? Life's an illusion. Lightbox images present an illusion of three-dimensionality and also an illusion of contrast that is really an artifact. It's a created kind of thing. Arrangement, and I like to say that floral arrangement is the most important part of any photography on a lightbox. Exposing, processing, presenting. Why do it? Well, you know, I think that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and the why do it is because you can create images like this one. This became, of course, the cover, the wraparound cover of Creative Garden Photography, picked out, I should add, by the publisher from a number of choices that we gave. We fully approved of the choice, but were pleasantly surprised to find it picked. The point really being, what happens when you put a flower on a piece of or a white card or a piece of white paper or something like that and photograph it? I used to ask this when I had in-person workshops, and most people sort of looked at me, but usually some people answered, the background goes gray if you photograph it using the settings your camera chooses for you. So there really are only two ways to get a full-on white background behind a flower. One is to put the flower some distance from the white background and light the two elements separately so that you have separate lighting for the flower and the light box, or the flower in the background. That way you can control the exposures. The other thing you can do is put the flowers on a light box and use a high key HDR set of exposures to blend together to make the kinds of images that I've been showing here. And I will go into more detail on that, on how you expose and how you process later in this presentation. This is a close-up image, close to macro, of a Magnolia stellata, a star magnolia, one of my very favorite flowers and one that grows in wonderful abundance around here. And what I use this image to point out is that translucency is essentially an illusion. Translucency is created using classic chiaroscuro techniques. Chiaroscuro was a concept and term invented during the Renaissance around the time of Leonardo da Vinci. And the original concept was that you can create an illusion of depth by contrasting light and dark. So that's what happens on the flower petals you see here, where the illusion is that underneath the petals, you see the stems and twigs of the bush that this magnolia grows on. And in fact, those are just contrast of light and dark painted in. Here's a pair of dynamic daffodil duet, where the most effort that I put into this photo was truly on the sort of onion skin-like sleeves that go down the wonderful daffodil stems. And it was photographed on a light box with a scanned paper background put in afterwards in Photoshop. is Cherry Branch, one of my fairly widely licensed images, um, notably in Japan, which always pleases me because it's sort of like cherry blossoms in Japan is like bringing coals to Newcastle, as the saying goes. Uh, and I photographed this upright with a light box behind it. This is what I have found for myself is that artistically speaking, the pandemic has been a wonderfully creative time. What I urge people to do is to make the pandemic their private artist in residency. And I have really done this. And here's one of the images, this panorama early in probably toward the end of March, beginning of April, when our pop-overs were really going great guns here in the garden. And here's another one from the comparable time frame. This also is Icelandic poppies, Papaver nudicale, and we may talk more about this image later on in the presentation. I call this one Peonies Mon Amour. It's one of my fairly older images. I do love to photograph peonies. What you have here is a simulation of the way the actual print of this image looks. I like to print this image on a washi called Unryu, spelled U-N-R-Y-U, and it's got these flecks in it that are dragon's breath flecks that have a particular look. So each print is actually unique. And down on the lower right, you see my inken. It's a Japanese style chop that says photography as poetry. So I've said, and I will say it again, that arrangement is the most important part of photographing flowers on a light box. Anybody can master the techniques. So how you set the flowers up is really what matters. And I also will quote Bokuyu Takada, correct handling of flowers refines the personality. Well, maybe I'm not so refined, I don't know. So general organizational principles of flower arrangement for lightbox photography. The thing about this photograph of iris and popovers is that the iris stems forms a tree-like structure that makes the general arrangement of the flowers. Another very common and wonderful arrangement is the mandala, shown here with a starfish in the center. It's kind of an unconventional mandala because of the mixture and match of materials, but besides being a great organizational principle, kind of like the sun and solar system, mandalas represent the universe in some faiths, and they're a very meditative way to arrange flowers and flower petals. Here's another mandala that's been put on a scanned background. And this is a variant of the mandala, which is a spiral. You will recognize that the pebbles that I put, first of all, to get pebbles of this kind of color, they have to be moistened. And second of all, that the exposure value for a opaque substance like a rock is going to be very different than the exposure values for the blue hydrangea little blossoms. So there's an exposure problem that really can only be solved using high key HDR exposure techniques. This is another organizational principle, which is really to mass objects. Here we have the little hydrangea petals that, if you look at a bigger hydrangea blossom, what it is they're all these small ones. So to make something like this, you have to cut carefully the blossoms off and then arrange them. So these are really quite small. And here's another kind of bulk arrangement. This one I call Into the Vortex of the Universe, for the chaos that it creates. And it's also been a widely reproduced and licensed image of mine. But to some extent, the underlying structure here is either a grid or a sort of crosshatch. Okay, so here's the deal on exposing. The 2-cent version is to create a white background. You want to have 7 to 10 exposures. You start completely overexposed. You use manual exposure on your camera. You bracket shutter speeds by 1 EV increments. You stop when you get to the dark side, meaning stop when you get to the normally exposed histogram. And you reserve an HDR blend, which is something I go into in more detail in some of my in some of the webinars you'll find on YouTube, and most certainly in the creative garden photography book. I should note that all the techniques I'm talking about here are covered in the book in quite a bit of detail. So here's an example of exposures. This is an arrangement of dahlias. And here's an underexposure histogram. Exposure looks like that. Here's an overexposure histogram. And all we care about from the point of view of this kind of flower photography is the part of the exposure that is to the right of the midline. I really need to point out, in fairness, what a histogram is, and that's something, again, I explain in detail in this book. A histogram is a bar graph of the exposure values that the camera is looking at. So what the histogram is going to look like will depend on what you're photographing. There are sub cases where a proper histogram is almost entirely black, and some where it's almost entirely white. It's almost never the parabola you see here, realized way that a histogram is represented. But I do urge people to get familiar with the exposure histogram on their camera, how to review it, and what a histogram means, because in all fairness, it is a more accurate measure of the exposure you are making than the way the image looks on your LCD. Because while your LCD is trying very, very hard, it can only do best what it can do. So it shows you a rendition of the exposure you are about to make in its best light, but that's not necessarily an accurate rendition. I've been shocked sometimes, until I learned better, when I look at the exposure rendition of, say, a night image, and it looks fine on the LCD. I'll take that, I'll take it home. And I get back and open it up, and it's way too dark by 3 or 4 stops, 3 or 4 EVs. And that's because the poor LCD was trying to show me what it thought I wanted to see, but it wasn't giving me an accurate rendition of what the exposure is. So by all means, review the LCD when you take a photo, but also check the histogram. Remember our dahlias. If you look at the second exposure from the left, that's the brightest exposure at 4 seconds, and it goes through to the darkest exposure you see to the left at a 30th of a second. So to go run through those exposures to make that image, I would go 4 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, half a second, a quarter of a second, an eighth of a second, a 15th of a second, and a 30th of a second. And here's what the 4 second exposure looks like. I'm not quite sure how it's coming through on your screen, but it should look almost completely white. You can kind of see where the flowers were, but that's about it. And here's the 1/30th of a second. This exposure is what your camera will tell you where you should make your picture. And you can see that if you just took this picture, you'd have a gray background. Your flowers, some of them would verge to the black. The white ones might be a little gray, but altogether it would be unimpressive. Okay, let's turn to how you process these images. Here's a layer stack showing the 4 second exposure down at the bottom. And then incrementally, I'm adding in Photoshop exposures to the stack to make up the complete image. Again, this is a technique that is explained in creative garden photography. The lighter the exposure, the more of it goes into the blend. So sometimes I liken this kind of layer stack to a wedding cake, where the lighter exposures get more and more, and the less of it using layer masks get less. And at the top, I just have a pinch of an HDR, an automatic HDR blend that is put in at the top of the image. So here's the 5-cent version, or 10-cent version, or whatever you call it these days. Start with the most overexposed, use the same processing settings on each, add darker images with layers, layer masks, and the brush tool, and if it works and if it's necessary, add a little bit of automatic HDR blend at the top of the stack. And here's some examples. Another technique that I explain in creative garden photography that I'm not going into here is how once you have an image on white, you can invert it and turn it to black using really one command in LAB color, and also how you can generally manipulate colors to your heart's content. I call this one Pale Garden. And we're going to move on to photography on black. So it's worth noting before I start, and I think I'll probably be saying this again, that photography on black produces different results than photographing on white and inverting the image. Both are interesting techniques and have their places, but this is simply photographing on black. With this Camellia japonica, in fact, I photographed it in situ in a horticultural nursery outside, and I used the techniques that I'm about to show you to turn the background it was against completely black. Recently, this is a pandemic dahlia that I put on a strip of black velvet. As it's worth investing, if you're going to do this, in a high quality piece of black velvet. Probably 2 yards of it will do. Black velvet has the deepest black and the least shine on it. Here's a ranunculus photograph the same way. Photography on black is the opposite of Lightbox photography. It's related but not the same to getting a black background by inverting the L channel, and I explain this and the difference in creative garden photography. Here's a dandelion photographed in sunrise with myself on my belly and my macro lens on the camera on the tripod, and processed in the same way to create a black background. This is a lavender plant photographed on black velvet and processed via something that I call the Blossfeld effect, after the wonderful botanical artist Karl Blossfeld. Again, there's a section in creative garden photography on Karl Blossfeld and how to achieve the Blossfeld effect in your own work. And a Blossfeldian dahlia, and a top of a popover pod. It looks to me like a anemone or sea creature or something. And I'm going to remind all good Star Wars people to rely on the exposure histogram, not the LCD. The LCD is trying to be nice, but it is not your friend. So this was the exposure histogram you wanted for Lightbox work. Here is what you want for photographing either on black velvet in your living room or my living room, or in field where you have a situation with a dark background. You're only interested in the dark side of the histogram. In post-production, there are 2 ways to go about it. If you were only able to make a single shot, then multi-raw processing is what to do. You open up an image and you open up a darker version of the same image, and you put the lighter version processed for the flower on top of the darker version processed for the background. Low-key hand HDR means combining imagery yourself using layers and layer masks to make a combination of an image that has the background as black but has the flower as perfectly exposed. And here's the short version of hand HDR exposures for working on black, though it's also could be used generally. So depending on the situation, usually you want something like 6 or 7 or 8 exposures, bracket by 1 EV for each exposure. Generally keep the ISO constant, and it's best to bracket the shutter speed unless the subject's in motion and or depth of field is not an issue. The reason you would prefer to bracket shutter speed is that if you bracket aperture, you may change the depth of field, which may change the image. So that's a problem. So if you can, you want to bracket shutter speed. That's the best thing to bracket. Also, I personally bracket manually by turning the exposure knob on my camera. I currently use a Nikon D850, but most cameras that will photograph in manual mode will allow you to turn exposure shutter speed manually. However, many programs also have bracket programs, so you can use a bracket program if you would prefer to achieve the same results. Generally, if you're going to use multi-raw processing to the dark side, you want to start with -4 EV and add incremental exposures at 1 EV intervals. And so here's the short version for low-key hand HDR. So as I said, 7 to 10 bracketed exposures. Start at the correct exposure, go darker 1 EV at a time, bracket shutter speed, stop when the image is black, the histogram's pinned to the left, and process from darkest to lightest. You don't have to go all the way to black. In fact, probably you want to end up using something that's completely black. So that last point is, but film is so expensive, right? It doesn't cost any more to do an additional digital frame. And process from darkest to lightest is important because that's the only way you're really going to get a black background on the images. So here are some examples of images created using these techniques. This is a collection of my dried flowers with a few other things put in. It doesn't have to be just flowers. Like in this image, you can put a vase on a table and put a black curtain behind it and create a black background that way. This Gloriosa lily, a highly toxic plant, incidentally. If you want to practice a little poisonous toxicology, it would be your go-to flower, is on a mirror. And so the mirror, so it's propped up on a mirror. A black background is placed behind the mirror to beam into the mirror, and then the flower is exposed in that way. With these orchids in one of our bowls, what I did was I put the bowl on a piece of black velvet and put the flowers in the bowl and then exposed using the exposure suggestions I've just shown you. And this is a field dandelion processed in the way I mentioned with multi-raw processing, camera on a tripod, bracketed to create a black background against the stark white interior of the dandelion. I was struck with this tulip, how with a single petal off, I could see the inside, and we all want to know what's inside our flowers. So I photographed it on a black background. I used the techniques that I've shown to process it, and then I added a texture overlay to create the sort of painterly effect you can see in the background of this image. And this is a young Gibera, African daisy, on a black background with the side light coming in to light it up like this. Okay, moving on to intimate flowers. This is a notorious red rose of mine, shall we say, and it is notorious because if you look up Georgia O'Keeffe red rose in Google Images and various other places on the internet, you'll find my image as the response. So I wasn't trying that hard to create a Georgia O'Keeffe effect when I made it. What I was trying to do was to create a very sculptural light and dark image. And to do this, I placed it where there was sunlight coming in hard from the right, and I used a telephoto macro lens to expose the image. With this image of iris petals, I lit the iris from behind and photographed it using a 100mm macro lens to get the image nice and crisp on the sort of wings of the iris. Here's a nice Lightbox image, very close up and intimate. And it's worth pointing out that that you can use Lightbox kinds of lighting and photographic and processing techniques to create three-dimensional images. It's really a technique that's about backlighting, so you could do it for things like these multicolored iris in a vase on a table, as well as for classical subjects that are just placed on the Lightbox. Another vase on a Lightbox with tulips. And here with this one, with these tulips, I placed a collection of tulips with the center bud like that, and photographed straight down using using my 50mm macro to create a nice crisp image on a Lightbox. Very little of the Lightbox is showing. It's processing an image like this really fun and easy. And you can get really, 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 really close to petals and begin to see patterns like this one. All these kinds of images are possible to do inside. But not only possible, that's where they were taken, and that's where they should be taken. With this image, I placed the fuchsia on a Lightbox. It's a fuchsia blossom, obviously. And the yellow light coming through is the light box coming through the back end of this thing. It reminds me of a jet engine. And I got really, really, really close. The camera was basically sitting on the Lightbox too. So I'm at the same level or even looking a little up at the blossom with my lens. And sometimes when you look at flowers, when you look at petals up close, what you'll see is some little imperfections that don't necessarily meet the eye or that you don't understand are quite there. And those can make for exquisite patterns and things that you don't see with naked eye in a good photographic subject. So here with this intermediate, very light petal, you can see a slight, perhaps it was a flaw on the upper right, but I think the break there in the pattern is really fascinating. I love to photograph flowers up close, personal, get to really understand them. Sometimes I've called particular spider webs my spider web studio, because if you want to do an image like this, which is an extreme close-up refraction of a daisy in the water drop, and in the water drops you can see that there are multiple versions of it, you need a location where you can put the flower underneath the water drop. So what we have here is water drops on a spider web, and below it a flower. The flower is refracted, it's the technical term, and if you read creative garden photography, you will learn the difference between a refraction and a reflection. And I used a telephoto macro lens to create this image, because the big challenge in this kind of macro photography is getting out of the way of your own equipment. What would happen if I photograph this with a conventional focal length macro lens, like say a 50mm normal focal length macro? What would happen would be that I would be so close to this water drop that almost all you would see in it would be the reflection of the lens. So a water drop itself functions as a kind of globe or fisheye. It reflects everything that is in the world around it, and it may refract differently than it reflects, but that's what's going to happen. So the only way you can successfully create an image like this is to use a telephoto macro lens, often to get close enough with the addition of extension tubes and perhaps a close-up filter as well. I don't know, this is an image that has been widely used of mine. I won't say licensed necessarily, but it has appeared in all kinds of parts of the internet where it probably shouldn't appear. It was just a water drop on a papaver nudicoli in my near backyard a number of years ago. So flowers can be interesting because they're so suggestive, really. People go birds and bees and flowers and trees and automatically start thinking things, and that's great associations. Here's a wonderful papaver, a corn poppy variety called the Dawn Chorus. And with this image, the idea here was to intentionally use low depth of field. So Henri Cartier-Bresson, the famous photographer, has a great quote that I'm going to use in my upcoming webinar on photographers and writing. He says, "Focus is so bourgeois." And that's actually the real quote is, "Sharpness is so bourgeois." And that's funny on so many levels, really. But it is true that many workshops, the question is, how do you get something tack sharp? A great technical question, but not all images are meant to be sharp across the image. Sharpness is so bourgeois. Well, this image is from a visual point of view. It's about the contrast between the sharp center of the poppy and the very sort of beautiful painterly background of other poppies in my living room, as it happens, but that's where they are. And of course, the way you make an image like this is by opening your lens all the way up so that you can have a minimum depth of field. And here's a nice core of a peony, the flowers within the flowers of a peony. A backlit poppy. This one, what I actually did was I put the flower in front of a window with sunlight coming in. I put a piece of tissue paper between the window and the flower so the lighting was a little bit diffused. And then I exposed for the front of the flower, not the back. So it's a single exposure backlit. And another center of a poppy. Here's another sharpness is so bourgeois photo, because what I did here, this is a peony where you can see water drops on a stem of another flower through a gap in the petal. And what I did was I focused on the gap of the petal with a long telephoto macro lens, my 200 millimeter Nikkor f4 macro lens, and let the front of it simply go totally out of focus and pink. Fun and not bourgeois. But sometimes it is fun to do a extreme close-up macro where the business end of everything is in sharp focus, like this one where you see the pillar that's holding up the entire stamen and calyx formation in the center of an oriental lily. Widely reproduced Magnolia stellata of mine. I'm not sure why this one's got picked, but it has. And again, I used a Lens Baby velvet to make this image. The Lens Babies, as many of you likely know, are lenses that are specially designed to have the center spot be sharp, but the exterior rings around it to be it's soft, pleasant, out of focus. So I focused on the center with my Lens Baby velvet here and let the rest go nicely out of focus. Here's a Lightbox image that you might call wabi-sabi, based on the Japanese term about the beauty and things when time passes and decay. These are the blue Artemisia petals. I don't really remember what the yellowish oranges were. I think Gaillardia, also from my pandemic garden. And I call this one Paul Klee in Wabi Sabi's garden because the formation of the composition was inspired by a Paul Klee painting, and one of my very favorite artists. And you can see there's some wabi-sabi here on the petals. Most of the flowers are gone, but they're still very beautiful as time passes. And another wabi-sabi, this one's a mandala with fuchsias and dahlias from my pandemic dahlia bed. And here also, I've got another crop of fuchsias that are just coming along nicely, so we'll have to see what I do with those in the next few days. I made this one for my beautiful wife, Phyllis. It's called A Bouquet for Phyllis, and it's a Lightbox composition done in the living room. A couple of lovers talking to one another. Pay careful attention if you do this kind of image to the stems, because while the excitement is in the blossoms, the motion and gesture and even emotion often comes largely from the stems. The center of this image is a Mattia poppy, a very, it's It's one of the actual native poppies that grows here. The range is basically Mexico to mid-California, and it's a bush poppy, and very odorific, very unusual, and very great for translucency because obviously it's white, and if you put it on a light box, you can see all its companions around it. And I know that Mercedes is sending out a discount code. Here's a slide with the discount code for my black and white book and one for my garden photography book. And here's how you can find me. I'm very welcome. Email and we'll answer it. I'll try to at any rate. And there I am on Instagram. There I am on YouTube. And there's my website. And I am very happy to take questions.
Great. Thanks, Harold. That was really cool. Seeing your images that way and hearing a little bit of the story behind them was really neat too.
Thanks.
So I'm going to start with this one question. These two questions came in like right behind each other, and I think they might have the same or a similar answer. The first question is, can you address what product you use to hold the flowers upright when photographing down on them? And then the kind of paired question is, in the image of the fuchsia, how did you keep the flower in position while photographing it?
I'm not 100% sure which the image of the fuchsia images they're referring to, or the one where it looks like a jet engine. We can clarify that. In the meanwhile, let me start on the first question. You know, product or products. I mean, improvisation is the photographer's best friend, and more generally, part of the craft of photography has always been about improvisation. I would also refer people to the many webinars I have done on this process, which show quite a few examples, some in real time of me doing it. But paper clips are a good way to go. You can bend the bottom of the paper clip to make a base and put the paper clip through the stem of the flower. That works. In some cases, if you have something like a bud vase, you can put a flower in the bud vase and get it to stand up that way. Tape sometimes does the trick. There's a product called museum gel, which is clear and you don't see, and lets flowers stand upright. And you know, mostly it's things like this that I use. The fuchsia itself, if we're talking about the image, I think we are, was just sitting on the light box. It wasn't really standing up. Okay, so it was a horizontal picture, not a vertical picture.
Let's see, the next question here is, how big of a light box do you need for panoramic images?
Well, you know, I like to say that it's like you can't be too rich, too thin, or have too big a light box. Okay. That said, when I started out doing this, when I first started experimenting with the technique, I made my panoramas actually by piecing together panes. So for example, the image you see behind you here on questions was actually pieced together with two photographs, so split down the middle. That becomes a little crazy making, because if you have, say, 6 exposures in each image and 2 images, and that's 12 exposures you have to organize to get it right in post-production. It's much better, of course, to have a bigger light box. I would say that, you know, realistically, it also depends on what resolution you're expecting to get. I do have the issue that many of my images are reproduced, and some of my work ends up as panoramics in places like hospitals and hotels and places like that, where they're expected to be very big. So I do want to make a very high resolution file for anything like a panorama. So, you know, I would probably not want to try for panoramic work with anything much less than about 1 meter on the long dimension. I hope that answers the question. And again, I would refer people both to the Creative Garden Photography book, where there's a lot of material on this, and also to my website, where there are FAQs, and also to the YouTube channel, where I have just a ton of information on this technique.
Great. Yeah, we have a few more questions about light boxes, so I will group those all together. What is a light box? Are the flowers pressed flat on there under a piece of glass? How large is the light box and what type of light do you use?
A light box is, thank you for the questions, everybody. A light box is simply a box with lighting with some form of translucent material covering it, usually plexiglass that is milky rather than totally clear. You can improvise light boxes. I've had students who used an old, when we were doing a macro workshop in an old historic building and there wasn't much in the way of facilities, using an old a window from an old door covered with white paper, that will work. The typical light boxes are lit either these days with LED lights or daylight fluorescent tubes. Those are the common lighting sources that are used. These are, so to be clear, these are not stroboscopic. I mean, there's no reason you couldn't use a strobe as a lighting source in it, but there's no real reason to, because continuous lighting lets you see what you're doing. When I started out, I would say doing this, I would say that daylight balanced fluorescent tubes were best. These days, probably LED are best. On my website, in the FAQs on photographing flowers for transparency, there's a plan and bill of materials for building a light box yourself at home with about $100 worth of materials from Lowe's or Home Depot. There also are essentially light boxes or light tables these days that people want to get rid of from old things like lithography shops, printing shops, and places like that, because nobody much uses old analog light boxes anymore. The one I started out working on was a slide table from an old photo outfit called Light Impressions. I had carried it with me from my studio in New York all the way across the country, and I figured, well, I don't have any slides anymore. Let me get something out of this and see if I can photograph flowers on it. In terms of the specifics of what kind of light box to get and all that kind of thing, I suggest taking a look at the FAQs on my website. If you have questions after that, you can feel free to shoot them to me. These are not under glass and they are not pressed. Sometimes, rarely, I will use a heavy piece of glass to press a flower and then photograph it, but I really prefer not to do that, and it's risky because it sometimes will crack petals. Sometimes I use small pebbles to and a bit of warm water on the petal to mold it into shape so that it gets into the shape I want. That, you know, in some cases, not all that often, but that I do, but none of them are photographed under glass. Did I cover everything here, Mercedes?
Yes, and we had one more Lightbox question come in while you were answering that one, which is your fruit and vegetable photos on the Lightbox. Does it get messy, and how do you keep it clean? How do you keep it from getting messy?
Yeah, well, one of my pandemic things was to photograph sliced fruits and vegetables on the Lightbox. I did not show any of those images today. Though I suppose some of them could be called creative garden photography, since some of them were my pandemic vegetables. It gets messy. Yes, it does get messy. Soap, water, rags, paper towel, and it turns out there's some form of alcohol as a solvent that will actually take out any stain on a Lightbox cover. I have to admit also that, you know, if it doesn't get messy, where's the fun? And, you know, tools are meant to be used. I mean, I will take my camera on a tripod out into the surf for a long exposure wave. So am I going to worry too much about getting tomato stain on a Lightbox? Not really. So as Miss Frizzle likes to say, make mistakes, get messy, and have fun, be creative. Miss Frizzle being the Magic School Bus School Kids author. I'm sorry, go ahead, Mercedes.
That's okay. When you add a texture overlay, am I correct to assume that you end up having to erase, or do you paint out the texture on the flower?
Well, that's a great question. The answer to it is, however, it depends. You would be correct, whoever asked this, if I were using a normal blending mode for the texture overlay, that I would have to paint out the flower. I would have to mask it. using a layer mask and paint on the mask to be a little more precise. However, that may not be the case if I'm not using a if I'm using something like soft light blending mode, where, and particularly if I'm not at full opacity. In fact, I may not be painting it out. On my website, I have I have an FAQ about blending modes and textures. And B, I have a link to a course I did, a full course with more than you ever wanted to know about this stuff with the LinkedIn Learning that you can go to from my website.
Great. Let's see what's next. Are all the photos HDR or were some of them direct in camera?
It's a hard question to answer. I mean, that's sort of like, you know, the cliche, do you this, do you that? Let me put the question a different way, because what is HDR is not so clear these days. Are some of the pictures that I showed single exposure? And there the answer would be absolutely yes. And in fact, almost everything I showed in the intimate flowers segment of this presentation was a single photograph. How I process it is a different issue. The Lightbox images are almost all multiple exposures. That's in their nature.
Great, thank you. What else do we have here? If you had to choose one macro lens, would you buy 50 millimeter or 100 millimeter?
Well, that's a great question. And first of all, there are other choices between 50 and 100. So there's also there's the 180 to 200 range. And I also have a Wacko 24 millimeter macro that I've made a fair amount of use of lately during my pandemic glass photography phase, which is a whole different story. But, you know, it depends on the purpose is really the point. I think if I were looking for an all-round general macro lens, I would probably get a 50 millimeter. They're less expensive to start with and less heavy. I really love my 50 millimeter f2 Zeiss. That's a great macro lens, and for an optic that's as beautiful and perfect as the Zeiss optics are, it's really not all that expensive. And Sigma makes a nice one in the same focal range. However, it does have the problem about getting out of your own way that I mentioned. You'll find getting out of your own way, if you're going in real close, easier with a telephoto macro, either something in the 100 range or even longer. What I have to say also is that the technical side, the craft of photography, when it involves hardware like lenses, is always an issue of trade-offs. You never get something without giving something up. You have to ask yourself then, if you're, you know, we all have limited budgets in life. We have to ask ourselves then, what is most important? The thing is that the longer a telephoto macro gets, the less close it's likely to get. Closeness with macro lenses is measured in magnification ratio, which is measured in how the image on your sensor compares to life size. So a 50 millimeter macro will get you to 1:1. It will be the same size on the sensor as it is in real life. You know, imagine this photographing something like a beetle or the center of a flower. A 100 millimeter macro is likely to only get you to a half life size on the sensor. So if you want to get closer, you'll have to add auxiliary things or crop in. So a question to ask is, how close do you want to get? If you want to get really close, you better check that part of the specification of the lens, as well as the focal length. You also need to understand how much you care about optical quality. Most lenses are going to be pretty good at f8 or 11, but fully stopped down at f16 or f22, optical refraction becomes a serious issue. So you need to understand how important that's going to be. Are you going to use the lens fully stopped down? Also, modern computer-aided optical design has led to some interesting innovative optics. There's a company in China called Venus Optics, going by the trade name of Laowa, who's got a macro lens, which I happen to own, a 100 mm macro that goes to 2-to-1 magnification. Now, optically, it's not the world's niftiest lens, but you can judge for yourself. There is a plate in the Creative Garden book taken with that lens and labeled as such. I do note that in the book, I've labeled what macro lens I used for every photo taken with a macro lens. So you can make comparisons that way. That might be a helpful thing to want to do. I also note that personally, I have called myself the Imelda Marcus of macro lens. If it's a macro lens and it fits my camera, I want it.
We have a couple questions about focus stacking. Do you use focus stacking with HDR? Do you use Helicon focus stacking, or do you only photograph with multiple exposure?
Focus stacking. When I focus stack, I tend to use Photoshop software, which is perhaps not quite as specialized and high powered as Helicon, but works quite well. There are there's a section on focus stacking in Creative Garden Photography that explains what you need to know. Focus stacking is something that's different from HDR, but you can combine the two things. You run into the same problems as I was explaining with panorama photography in HDR, that you get a lot of photos. If you take 10 focus stacked images for getting in close and 5 for HDR, well then you're pretty quickly up to 50 images you have to manage. There is software that will do that management for you if you shoot in a particular order. There are two styles of focus stacking. One is to use a precise measurement to measure off quadrants when you're doing it. The best way to do that is to use a piece of gear called a focusing rail to move a precise amount each time. So this becomes a very very technical kind of photography. The other thing you can do is say, okay, I really have two planes here, say the top end of a flower pistil and the back end of a leaf. I will photograph one for each and then just use layers and masking to combine them in Photoshop. I do both of these things. I do them less often than one might think. I find that focus stacking is a huge subject of reader comments to me about my books. I'm darned if I understand completely why, because actually it's applicable in a relatively rare set of circumstances. I would much prefer to make a single shot for depth if I can, but you can't always, so that's when you use focus stacking. But thanks for the questions about it.
A subject of one of your bullet items was softness versus clarity. Can you please discuss and perhaps show some examples?
Well, I did show some examples. For example, that tulip where the center of the tulip had clarity and was sharp and the outside didn't, and also the Magnolia stellata of the same thing. Generally, I like to rule my photographic life by you don't go one direction without also going another direction. So for the most part, and generalizations are dangerous, but for the most part, an entirely soft image is boring. And perhaps an entirely focused image is boring because viewers don't know where to put their eyes. So it's often nice to experiment with images that both have sharpness, focus, and also at the same time have softness and lack of focus. Thanks.
I just want to say I'm getting a few questions about specific gear and stuff like that, and I'm not going to ask them because I find they're not always relevant to most people that attend. So do you have a spot on your website that recommends gear that people could go to if they have questions or want particular?
Well, I'm not really, thank you, Mercedes, and thanks for not also asking all of the specifics. I am going to note that I will take emails, as I said. Generally, I'm not a gearhead, first of all. Okay, no, I don't have a spot on my website that discusses specific gear. I have a bias towards Zeiss because they've helped support me over the years. I shoot Nikon. I believe what Ansel Adams once wrote, that the most important gear is that which is found 12 inches behind the camera. It's the last thing that's important here, really. and shoot me if you will, but that's how I feel about it. I feel that, you know, when I describe what I do for a living, I say I'm an artist, photographer, and writer, not necessarily in that order, but the artist is certainly the most important part of it. And, you know, I don't think there's any other field where of art where there's such emphasis on gear. I mean, you know, painters spend a lot of time saying, oh my God, I got the best camel hair brush here. You got to see it. It can do 3:2 in the Hirsute feral whatever competitions. No, I don't think so. So I'm, with all respect, probably the wrong person to be throwing too much of that at.
I like this question. Do you have any tips for handling cut flowers to prolong their life in a photo session?
Well, yeah, I do. And it's a great question. You know, there's a certain sadness with which I approach Lightbox photography because, you know, we always hurt the ones we love, and it's hard to photograph flowers on a Lightbox without actually killing them. Ultimately, apart from anything else, the heat of the Lightbox is not good for them. Um, I've been reassured a little by Phyllis and others there that, well, maybe you're immortalizing them too, but, and you know, at least one's not destroying human models. But okay, joking around aside, first of all, proper handling of flowers involves maintaining them before you're ready to photograph in good shape. That means, depending where they come from, after they come in, you want to cut them on the diagonal about a 1/4 inch above the end of the stem before you put them in water. It's nice to use plant food in those things that come in little packets from florists, or maybe if you get them at a Trader Joe's or supermarket, you'll find little packets of these things. What I do recommend on that is don't use the proportions that is recommended on the label. Cut it down by about half. Warm water, it helps preserve them, and it helps preserve petal life. So if you rub a little warm water on a flower as you put it on the Lightbox, it will likely last longer. So keep the Lightbox off when you're not actually photographing. I think those would be my top picks there.
Great, thank you. What tricks did you use to mask the dandelion when stacking the 7 to 9 images in Photoshop?
I don't think I used any tricks. Me use tricks? I mean, you know, one thing that's possible in a situation like that, which is a very complex potential mask subject, you're not going to do by hand dandelion petals, is to select by color. So perhaps that's what we're talking about. Also, I do recommend the Topaz masking tool. I forget what it's called, as a plugin to helps make masking easier.
Great.
Generally, I mask by hand.
Okay. When you show your work on the internet, how do you cut down on unauthorized image harvesting?
Wow, this is a big question. A big question, and I will note that we did a free webinar on copyright with a copyright attorney about a week ago, and that's going to get posted pretty soon to my YouTube channel. When I started with digital in 2004, 2005, I realized that I had a nasty dilemma on my hands. And that was, I could never, ever post, if I posted things, they would get stolen. And it's the nature of the beast. If I didn't post them, no one would ever know about me. And if no one ever knew about me, that would be very sad for my career as an artist and writer, and right, Mercedes?
Mm-hmm.
So I decided to post them and accept the inevitable theft. And woe betide the artist or photographer whose work isn't liked enough for people to steal it. That said, I was never happy about having my images taken from me, and I do feel that I certainly lost income because of it. I felt a little bit like a shopkeeper who says there's going to be some spoilage here, but that's the price of being in business. In 2015, a company called Pixy, spelled Pixsy.com, came to me and said, we're a fairly new, well-funded startup in business. What our business model is that we have a reverse search engine. You give us a feed to your images, we put it through our reverse search engine, and we will help get a licensing fee from any business entity that has infringed you. So I said, why not? And of course, they take a sales commission to which they're roundly entitled, and they have a network of copyright lawyers in most jurisdictions where copyright's respected around the world. The first time they ran my image feed through their engine, we came back with hundreds of thousands of infringements. So literally working through them would have been a full-time job. The upshot since then has been that they've continued to patrol my images for me. They've been an effective organization, and more organizations that would have taken my images for internet use have come to me and said, can we license them? So this is a situation where the power was, up until a few years ago, fully in the hands of infringers, and is now back to some extent more in the artist's hands.
Last question, which is, can we please see the last few reference slides again? So if you just want to go through those last couple slides that you shared, I think they had some of your information on them.
This one?
Yes. So there we go. I recommend, either for people who are watching and want this information, either take your screenshot now or write it down. I can also include these in the replay email tomorrow as well. So you can
I want to request anybody who is looking for my Creative Garden book, please go to Rocky Nook, not Amazon.
Thank you for that. And yes, the coupon that you will get in your email tomorrow as well is only redeemable on rockynook.com. You cannot use it on Amazon. So if you want to take advantage of that 40% off, you will have to use it on the Rocky Nook website.
And I will also say that Rocky Nook has an incredibly great deal where just for a few dollars more, particularly after the 40%, you can get both the e-version and the real book. I recommend, if you were only going to get one, get the real book, because there's nothing like a real book, and my photos look so nice in it. but it's nice also to be able to put an ebook on your device when you're out there in the field, or just want to look through it. And the ebook that Rocky Nook has is quite compatible with Kindle. So I'd also recommend doing that on the Rocky Nook site.
And since you mentioned it, I will note too that when you buy an ebook from Rocky Nook, you do get 3 files. So you get the Mobi file, which is compatible with Kindle and Kindle readers. You get a PDF file, which is compatible with most any reader and your computer or web browser. And then you get the EPUB file, which is compatible with iBooks and Apple products and iPads and stuff like that. And that's for one price. You don't have a choice. You just buy the ebook, you get all 3 of those files, and then you can do with them what you wish on your however many devices you have. So on that note, I'll just remind everyone that tomorrow you'll get an email with a replay and also a coupon code for both of Harold's books on rockynook.com. That coupon code will save you 40%. And if you do like the book, if you already have it, if you liked this webinar, go ahead and leave us a review on Amazon or on the Rocky Nook website. That's really helpful to us, to Harold, and to other readers or potential readers and photographers who are looking for more information. So,
I have to second what Mercedes is saying. Reviews are extremely helpful to me.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us today. This was a really cool webinar. It was beautiful to see more of your shots and hear and learn more about your process.
Thank you, Mercedes, very much for having me. I'm going to stop my share now.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We will talk to you soon. Bye, Harold.